Good afternoon, and welcome to the Carolina Codecast, the official podcast of the Carolina Code Conference. With me today is Ryan Edge. Say hello, Ryan.
Hello, my name is Ryan Edge.
Glad to have you here. So tell us about yourself. What you doing these days? How'd you get into it? Where are you living? What's going on?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Ryan Edge. I'm a software engineer, full stack, but I've been specializing in sort of front-end development my entire career. Currently, I am a tech lead for a company called Uptech Studio, and they specialize in working with startups, helping them go from the ideation phase, early pre-series, Series A, going from the ideation phase to actually having an MVP in the App Store or web or Play Store, and then help them figuring out their market fit.
Nice.
I've been an engineer since 2009. I graduated from a small college called Southern Polytechnic State University. Doesn't exist anymore. It actually used to be part of Georgia Tech in the 80s, and then it split off to become its own engineering school. And then it recently, I think in the last 10 years, joined Kennesaw State, which is also up in Marietta, Georgia.
Okay, interesting. Nice. So I'm a little tempted to ask you a little bit more about that. What was that like? At a program what was that like going through a program at a school that rolled into something else?
Yeah, so it's kind of funny because at the time, like I left and then they voted to join Kennesaw State. So by that time, I had been removed from the school for 3 or 4 years or so. But at the time that I was in school, there was this constant sort of, I don't know if you would call it competition, but making fun of like Kennesaw State or Kennesaw State making fun of Southern Poly. So I'd have
Rivalry.
to say, yeah, a little bit of a rivalry. And I'd have to say that the idea of joining Kennesaw State didn't go over well with most of the alumni from Southern Poly.
Yeah, I could see that. If for some reason Clemson suddenly had to merge with University of South Carolina, I think there would be problems.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
yeah, nice. All right, well, cool. So Uptech seems really like an interesting company. What type of technology are you working with over there?
Yeah, so at Uptech, we normally kind of tailor it to our clients, but if our clients don't have a specific need, then for our front end, we gravitate towards Flutter. I've been doing Flutter development for 6 years, almost essentially since its inception. Flutter is great because it allows you to target multiple platforms with one code base. So it supports all your desktop environments, all your mobile environments. And then also it allows you to build a web app. The web app to me is essentially like the least common denominator because it doesn't support things like SEO or SSO, but it at least allows you, if you've already got your mobile app or if you just want to go as fast as possible, it allows you to share as much code as possible across all your platforms. And then on the back end, we're mostly a Node shop, so we use Nest.js, which is kind of like a .NET-y type .NET MVC framework if you're from that environment. And then your standard AWS, Elastic Kubernetes, Aurora, Postgres backend setup.
Nice, nice. Well, so you mentioned Flutter, and I know from talking to you before that you've been a big fan of Flutter for a long time. I know some people in this area specifically who are also really big fans of Flutter. So talk to me a little bit about Flutter. That's a Google product, correct?
Yes, yeah, exactly. So Flutter, it's an open source project that is maintained and quote unquote owned by Google. It was started, I want to say back in 2014. Basically, two members of the Chrome team, Ian Hickson and Eric Seidel, they started with the idea of what if we removed backwards compatibility from the browser? Like, what kind of performance gains would we see? And they saw like very, very significant performance gains. I think it was like, 200 times or 300 times faster than what exists in the browser today. But obviously, you had a platform that you couldn't really, you couldn't go and give this to other developers and say, hey, now we're going to build all of our web applications using using this new platform. So then they decided to repurpose that platform for cross-platform development. And I want to say it was Dart Summit 2016, I want to say, was when Flutter was announced. At the time, it was called Sky. And I remember watching the videos for it. The demo wasn't even working. I thought the technology was really cool, but it obviously wasn't ready for prime time. So you fast forward a little bit, and I myself at the time am working for a company called Diligent, and we're doing cross-platform development with NativeScript. And this was 2017. And I watched Google I/O. Google I/O, they announced like the first, sort of alpha intro to Flutter talk, and that was kind of an indicator to me, okay, it's time to sort of get serious and start playing around with this thing. So that was where I started teaching myself how to use it. Would eventually turn some of those like play around projects into some freelance work, and eventually turned it into, what is now a 6-year career with Flutter.
Nice, nice. And so you aren't just playing with Flutter as a technology. You're also kind of involved with the Flutter community a little bit. So talk to me about that.
Yeah, yeah. So I am I'm a Google developer expert in Flutter, which to me just kind of means that I'm like a cheerleader for the technology. Like I'm an extension of developer relations,
Nice.
the developer relations team at Google. So I help co-organize the Flutter Charlotte meetup, which we try to meet once a month, but it's more like once every 2 months. And then I also co-organize GDG Charlotte. GDG stands for Google Developer Group, and that's more of a broad sort of group that talks about all of Google's technologies, everything from Angular to like AI/ML to GCP.
Nice, nice. So you're very involved with the at least the Google side of the Charlotte tech community. Um,
Yes, yes, yes. I try to be. I mean, I always say I feel like it could be a whole job in and of itself if you wanted it to be, and I wish I had more time to devote to growing like the developer community in Charlotte as a whole. But yeah, I try to be as involved as I can be.
okay, nice. Well, yeah, it definitely can be something that you can sink a little too much time into. I can vouch for that. But it is fun. And so are you doing any work with Flutter on your own?
Not currently. So I've done some freelance projects in the past with Flutter. So no client specific work. So I'd say probably the biggest thing that I've done lately is I'm a big fan of infrastructure from code frameworks. Which,
Okay.
if you're familiar with infrastructure as code, infrastructure from code takes things a step towards the making product engineers more productive, where you're essentially baking in your infrastructure and provisioning into your application framework. So the one that I'm really a fan of right now is called Nitric, and Nitric essentially looks like an Express API. But when you're saying, I want to build this API endpoint, or I want to create this job, then at build time or at distribution time, Nitric is actually smart enough to inspect what your code is doing and deploy all of your cloud infrastructure for you so that you don't have to build out your Terraform and do manage all that shit yourself. So if you're a product engineer, like I am, we have very small teams. Our current team is basically 3 developers,
Yeah.
and we actually went from 7 to 3, where we have this complex setup where we're using Elastic Kubernetes and we're using Terraform. It would be nice to rewrite everything in Nitric and to sort of reduce the responsibilities of right now we're product engineers plus platform engineers. And then you would just be essentially a product engineer. You'd be allowing Nitric to handle all of your infrastructure for you. And you get to focus on writing business logic.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, anytime you can get those efficiency gains for your team, especially for a small team, it pays huge dividends. Um, it's whenever I'm trying to talk people through their team efficiency and processes, it's never a situation of there's this one giant thing where we're wasting all this time. It's usually a small thing that you're doing over and over and over again. And so in IaC, that makes a lot of sense, or IFC, I guess. in this case. Yeah, I've done a lot of Terraform and Ansible myself.
Hmm.
I'd be interested to kind of see the effect of doing something like this. Is there any risk in um, is there any limitation in the providers that you work with? Or is it really highly tied to AWS? Or I'm not familiar with
Yeah.
it, so tell me a little more about it.
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons why I've been a big fan of Nitric or Nitric, and I've been communicating with their developers to say, hey, these are the things that I'm missing, or these are the things that could help the community. It's because Nitric is one of the few providers that is actually fully open source, and then also they offer extensibility. So it's possible for you if you already have a setup that's using Pulumi or you already have a setup that's using Terraform, they allow you to build extensions that'll just continue to use your existing pipeline, feed that into Nitric, and share infrastructure, or share configurations across the boundaries.
That's interesting. And so when you do these configurations, is it something where your entire team needs to be really up to speed on all the infrastructure components that are there, or does it kind of abstract it away a little bit? Like, what does that work? What does that look like in a development environment? I guess is what I'm really asking.
Yeah, exactly. So Nitric, yeah, it does abstract away the complexities um, of building your infrastructure. So let's say you're building an API and it's just like a simple hello world API that's going to take in a param and say hello to whatever that param is.
Right.
Um, and under the covers, like, if you're just building that API endpoint and you're testing that locally, it's very straightforward. Let's say you're using an Express-like API, it's just like API.get and then hello and your param. But once you actually have to deploy that thing, that's where the Terraform comes in that says, hey, I need a load balancer. I need to set up API gateway. I need to deploy this as a Lambda. And that is where you're still using that same API that you're familiar with, but under the covers, there are abstractions written that'll essentially inspect how your code is written and say, okay, he needs a load balancer, he needs API gateway, he needs, AWS Lambda. And then if you wanted to come in and say, I actually did this for when I was kind of demoing Nitric, I currently they don't support like Postgres as a primitive, so you'd have to write your own layer to either create a Supabase database or a Postgres Aurora database, and then inject your connection variables into your actual Nitric code, and that's fairly straightforward to do. There is a little bit of hand holding there, like they are planning on making the framework more extensible, but at the moment, it's you would have to have your Pulumi code separate or your Terraform code separate, and then have some wiring up logic there to connect the boundaries. But to me, it's a realization of what the promise of platforms like Terraform are, because I've always seen them as low level primitives that you can come in and build high level abstractions on to make cloud development easier for product developers.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's always layers upon layers too. I mean, because you've got stuff like CloudFormation specifically for AWS, and you've got
Hmm.
Terraform where you can go cross provider. But
Hmm.
even with Terraform, you still have to tweak certain things for different providers because it's not fully portable or anything because you still have to work with certain nuances and certain differences to get it just right. Um, and even then, if you're doing actual machine setups, you can technically do that with Terraform, but it's kind of a pain, and so you typically want to use something else for your for provisioning the instances or
Hmm.
for configuring the instances once they're there, like an Ansible or a Puppet or something along those lines.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think the power is that what you're seeing is there's this wide chasm between I want to do everything, roll my own infrastructure versus I just want this cloud provider to handle it for me. So to handle it for me, you have like the Vercels and the Netlifys of the world, and then the doing everything yourself, you have the AWS and the GCP. And I think that IFC tries to provide all of the value or as much as value as possible from that, somebody does it for you versus the do it yourself without giving up the flexibility of the do it yourself. So one of one podcast that I listened to while I was going down this journey. It was, I think, DevTools.fm. They interviewed the SST lead. And one thing that he said to me that kind of resonated was the idea that when you're using like a Vercel or a Netlify, you're essentially paying for expertise that you don't have.
Yeah.
And if you knew how to do these things, then you could get all the benefits of hosting your APIs using AWS Lambdas and not having to pay nearly as much money. But you give that responsibility to a Netlify, and they sort of reap the benefits of the cost difference there. So
Yeah.
like you have these frameworks like Nitric, who again Nitric SST, they're open source, and they say, we're going to build these abstractions for you, and we believe that they should be free, so we're going to give them to you for free and allow you to contribute back to.
Nice. Yeah, and that does make good sense as well in terms of the approach. Um, so can I assume that we'll typically use some Docker under the hood?
Yes, yeah, yeah. So using Nitric as an example, because that's the one that I've worked with the most. Nitric, they basically deploy, if you're building APIs, they deploy everything using, let's say we're using AWS in this example because they support all three platforms. But in AWS's case, you can deploy your Lambdas as Docker instances. And then you can also, coming back to the flexibility, you can define your own Docker instance rather than using the one that's just kind of built in there. So I was talking to Jai, one of the leaders there, and he was talking about how they bake in a whole lot of if you're using a node environment, they bake in all this complexity because they want to be able to handle like Prisma dependencies and migrations. But if you don't need that, you can create a much slimmer Docker instance and keep the size of your lambdas down a bit.
Nice. Okay. Yeah, that approach makes sense to me. I'm gonna have to go tinker with Nitric at some point real soon then.
Yeah,
So
yeah, no, it's been a lot of fun. Those guys are uber responsive. Like I want to say in January, I joined their Discord and I was like, hey, I wanna be able to build Nitric apps in Dart because I think there's a lot of value. There's not a really great backend story for Dart developers, but Dart is a great cross-platform language. And I want to say within the span of a month, communicating back and forth with them, they created their first experimental Dart API. So they're definitely like
nice.
one of the few places that I've been like, okay, here's this thing that I want, and they're very responsive about building things that they think provide value to developers.
Very, very cool. It's great to see that initiative pay off too.
Mhm.
So let's take a pause from the tech talk a little bit. I want to hear more about your background. So I know, like right now we're doing this interview. You're not actually in Charlotte at the moment.
No, yeah, I am. I'm currently in New Orleans. We do a family reunion every year in Lafayette, Louisiana, which is about 2 hours away from New Orleans. We've been doing it. Well, I've been doing it since my mid 20s. But my cousin, who was like the originator of it, he's been doing it since I don't know, he was like 12. So eventually, finally, I got called up to the big leagues and got an invite to the family. But yeah, we do a crawfish boil. We just kind of hang out, listen to music, dance, socialize. And then me being from New Orleans, but not actually being from New Orleans because I didn't live here long enough, as my parents would say, to be able to claim it. We always spend like a week in the city just to sort of fall in love with it essentially over again. And this week is particularly going to be fun because I'm going to my first film festival. It's called the Overlook Film Festival from the Overlook Hotel in The Shining, and it's just
Oh,
it's gonna be fun. Yeah,
nice. All right, that's I'm gonna have to tell my wife about that one. She's a big fan of The Shining, classic. So
yep.
so it's a horror film festival then?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So I've horror, sci-fi, and fantasy are like big in my house. I watch a little bit of everything. I always tell like new people like my secret power is just being able to see like a couple frames of a movie and know what movie it is. Even if I've never seen the movie, like I watch enough trailers to where I can like see the context clues and like figure out what movie it is. But like my first movies as a kid were like Clue and I want to say like Chucky and Aliens and Predator. Like those were my big four.
God, I forgot about Chucky. That's been a long time with the doll.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's funny because my mom will watch movies whenever we hang out with my parents, and she'll be like, "I don't understand what's wrong with you. Why do you like all these weird movies?" And it's like, well, the first movie we ever watched together was Child's Play, so you did this.
See, I didn't really watch any horror movies when I was growing up. I got into them when I was in college, and now it took a complete different turn, and now I can't even watch them anymore. It's like it actually bothers me now. The longer I've been a parent, the more I can't watch horror movies anymore. It's a weird thing that happens to your brain, I guess. But have you? I always lean more towards the horror comedy type
Mm.
movies. Like, have you ever seen Cabin in the Woods?
Oh yeah, love it, love
Yeah.
it. It's one of my favorites.
Uh,
Another really good one is Vicious Fun that we watched as a family like last year, and the whole without giving away too much.
I
Basically,
haven't seen.
you haven't seen it, yeah. Oh, so you'll love it. Basically, the premise is the main character he has a huge crush on his roommate, and he thinks that she's dating somebody who's probably like cheating on her, just doing scandalous things. So he follows the guy to the bar, and he gets passed out drunk at the bar and passes out in the closet and then he wakes up in the middle of essentially an AA meeting for serial killers. And the whole time he's trying to pretend to be a serial killer, and it's just like off the rails hilarious.
Oh man! All right, I'm gonna have to see that one.
Yeah.
I what was the movie with what was it? Salma Hayek and Antonio Banderas where they like just go into a bar and then it turns out it's a bunch of vampires or something. What is that movie?
Dust Till Dawn.
Dusk Till Dawn. That was it. That seems similar-ish kind of premise. You just accidentally walk into a crazy situation. So it's
Exactly.
called Vicious Fun.
Yeah, Vicious Fun.
All right, that might be one that my wife and I would like to watch because she still likes watching all that stuff. It
Yeah.
drives her nuts now. I walk in and I'm like I can't watch this anymore. She still loves them. She's one of the that'll watch like the murder mystery shows and all that stuff all the
Mm,
time. And for whatever reason, I just don't have the stomach for it anymore. I don't know what it is. But
yeah, no.
I love movies too, though. So I'd love to get to go to a film festival at some point. I'm the same way. I've watched so many movies growing up that half my vocabulary is just quoting movies. Uh, and
Yeah,
so
fortunately, I met somebody who shares my love for movies. So I told my wife, like, I knew that we were going to be in love when we watched Big Trouble in Little China, and she knew all the quotes just as well as I
wow.
did.
See, my wife also likes movies, but in a completely different way. She does not remember them at all.
uh,
I don't. It's like a superpower. Every time she watches a movie, even if she's seen it before, it's basically like the first time because her brain just doesn't register this is important information to retain.
yeah, yeah.
And whereas I can watch a movie one time and I'll be able to quote most of it within a minute afterwards, and I'll still watch it over and over and over again.
Well, I guess it works out then because if she were the type of person who got tired of the movie after the first viewing, then she's
Yeah,
going to forget it anyways. So you can just watch it again.
exactly. I always tell her I'm really jealous because she'll start talking through things during the movie like, oh, hey, so hold on, does that work out? Is he like the bad guy? I'm like, you're gonna have to watch and find out again. Don't know what to do with it. I'm actually pretty excited about it because this year, so my favorite movie of all time, and which I will argue till I'm blue in the face, is the greatest movie of all time. Many people will disagree with me on this. I understand if they're wrong. Is Wayne's World. Wayne's World is the single greatest movie ever made. Um, and I'm very excited that this year for the conference T-shirt we're doing Bohemian Rhapsody as the
Oh,
song
nice.
code for the T-shirt. That was the inspiration for the original Song is Code shirt that we did last year. We did oh god, Don't Stop Believing. We used Don't Stop Believing last year,
Yes.
and
Yeah, I
so that's
remember
going to
that
be an
one.
ongoing theme this year. Since we're doing Bohemian Rhapsody, I might have to see if I can work in like a Wayne's World clip on the screen or something like that as we're opening the conference and really just kick things off because they made that song famous again when that movie came out in the early 90s.
Yeah, no, Wayne's World is a classic. I don't know why. I don't know how you could disagree. I mean, I feel like there are some movies that are just quintessentially 90s. Like you think of the
Hmm.
Wayne's Worlds, the Speeds, the True Lies. It's like, oh, this captures everything that was great about the 90s and just bottles it up in like movie
Absolutely.
form.
There are certain movies like that where you can just, no matter how many times you watch it, it's always just fun to watch.
Yeah.
And it's
Yep.
not the funniest movie in the world. It's not the most dramatic movie in the world. It's not going to bring you to tears the same way. Uh, but every single time you watch it, you're just happy about
Yeah.
it. And
Yeah.
I don't really know a good way to describe it other than that. There, like another movie that kind of fills that void is, you remember the old Disney, like the '93 Disney Three Musketeers movie?
Yep.
Yeah, that's another one like that. It's just fun to watch. It's just
Yeah, no. It's not a particularly great movie, but like the comedy, the action, it's just quintessential, like it's part of that 90s experience. It's like,
Mhm.
it bleeds into, I guess a little bit of what you're talking about is like the nostalgia of some of these
Yeah.
movies, like it brings you back to a point in time or a place. And it's, it's perfect.
Yep. So, as a movie guy and a tech guy, I have to ask, what was your experience with The Matrix?
That was so I haven't been in tech that long. So like with the Matrix to me, that was like I don't know, it kind of changed the game for what you could do in action and how people perceived action. And you saw that with like even to this day, some of the influence of the Matrix still reign true. But I remember like I think I was in the ninth grade at the time and we were all watching it. We were just at a sleepover at some friend's house and we were watching it and it was like literally the instant where he's like dodging bullets and stuff. I think we rewound that fight maybe like five times. Like it was
Yep.
just so amazing and so different from anything else that was out there.
It was such a strange thing. Like I was in college when it came out, and we went and saw it at the movie theater, and we left the movie theater going, okay, well, that was pretty cool. And then it came out on DVD, and for some reason, we just couldn't stop watching it.
Yeah.
It became so much bigger when it was released to DVD, that everybody had to have the screensaver. You had to have like that little matrix screen as your screensaver to really be properly cool. And it was, I don't know, it was always just really interesting to watch that way. So you've obviously watched a lot yourself. What if you had to pick a favorite movie? What is yours and why?
Whew, favorite movie. So that's a tough one. I'd have to say, I mean, going back to like the movies that I watched during my childhood, um, Aliens, the second one, even though I love the first one, like I think it's equally timeless. You can watch
Kind of like
Alien
Terminator
and
2 versus the first
yeah,
Terminator.
yeah, exactly. Yep, yep. But I'd say Aliens, the second one, uh, Predator, the first one,
Nice.
and then Clue. Like those kind of capture all the things that I love, like in movie form. With Aliens, you got kind of like the horror, sci-fi, survival elements there. Similar thing with Predator, but you're mixing in a lot of action elements with both of those. And then with Clue, just the sarcasm, the sarcastic environment of the comedy, the who done it, like all of that pieces. I love the acting and how the characters riff on each other. All of that's just amazing.
Nice. The Clue is actually at the Peace Center in Greenville. I think right now, and we can't go because we're just really too busy. But my wife and I both love that movie.
Yeah.
So I can't remember what year it came out, but I know when it came out in the movie theater, they only showed one ending at each theater, and it wasn't until it actually came out on DVD that or on VHS, I guess, they combined all the different endings into one. So did
hmm
you get to see it in the theater, or because I can't remember when it came out? I don't know how young you would have been.
No, yeah, I watched it. I would just watch it on tape. Essentially every day I would watch it on tape. So
Nice.
I have to ask, like, which was your favorite ending?
Oh god. Uh, I've never actually had to choose a favorite ending of it. Yeah, I don't know that I could answer that. Yeah, I mean, the silliness of them just running from room to room, or it could have happened this way. Like
Yeah, yeah,
that in itself was cracking me up just on its own. But I didn't really have a favorite outcome, unfortunately.
yeah. Okay, okay.
How about you? Did you have a favorite ending?
Yeah, so for me, it would either be the first one where I think Miss Scarlet did it, or the second one where Miss Peacock was the guilty party. I was a huge fan of the Butler's character,
Yeah,
so like I did that
that
was why the last
was
one was
Tim
my
Curry,
least favorite.
right?
Yeah, Tim Curry. Yep. Yeah.
He's
Yeah.
fantastic.
So he's yeah, fantastic. I loved his character, so like that's why the last one was my least favorite. But I love the comedy of the first two and how they end.
Yeah, Tim Curry himself is just a classic. Like that '93 Three Musketeers movie. I mean, he was Cardinal Richelieu in that movie,
Yep.
and he did
Yep.
such a great job. We actually have a bird feeder in our backyard, and a family of cardinals that comes and feeds at it, and
Hmm.
we've named the dad Richelieu. And so,
Yeah. Yeah. No, another one of my favorite movies, which isn't that great of a movie, but like he killed it in that movie, was Legend, where he basically plays Lucifer.
oh, I didn't
Hmm.
never see that. Legend, interesting.
Yeah.
He's definitely one of my favorite actors, though. He's just classic. All right, so anything in particular that's going to be at the film festival that you're really looking forward to?
Yes, there are a couple of movies there. So I can't remember the name of one of them, but it's kind of like a slasher in the vein of like your Jason, so your Jason Halloween. There's another one called Azrael, which I don't really know much about it, but
Like from
Samara
the Smurfs?
Weaving. Hmm?
Like from the Smurfs?
No, 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 no. I think it's like one of those demon possession type movies.
Okay. That was
But
the cat in the Smurfs.
Yeah, yeah. But Samara Weaving is going to be in it. She's Hugo Weaving's daughter, and I
Okay.
love pretty much everything that she's in. She's like a fantastic actor, so I'm pretty sure that's going to be fun. And then there's another movie I can't remember the name of, but if you're a fan of like Arachnophobia, which is this horror movie from the 90s, it's
I
about
remember.
spiders. Like it's like a French take on that, where you have this apartment complex that's overrun with like these giant spiders. So it looks hilarious.
Nice. Nice. So with your enjoyment of the Alien movies and the Predator movies, I assume you enjoyed the Alien versus Predator movies.
No, not
Not even a
not
little.
even a little bit. So
Wow.
part of the issue there is like you took probably two of the most violent sci-fi movies of all time and combined them and made the first one PG-13. So like that right there was like, okay, yeah, what are we doing here? That's wrong. I think the second one, they came back like they were like, okay, we need to make this ultra violent, but then they left out the plot. So it's like I can appreciate them because as a fan and as someone who's read some of the like AVP comic books and some excerpts from the books, it's like, oh, finally you're getting the crossover there. And if you're familiar with like Predator, in the second Predator movie, there's basically a scene where he goes into the Predator ship and you see like a skull of an alien. So that's like, that's every kid's dream to finally see like the combination. But no, I'll argue. So my wife, she loves the AVP movies, and I'll argue with her all day. Like, no, these movies were terrible. Like, like they're absolutely
Sorry, honey,
horrible.
your opinion is wrong.
Yeah.
So, what about do you like other crossover movies like Freddy versus Jason or anything?
Yeah, so Freddy versus Jason, I mean, I guess you could argue like I loved Freddy versus Jason just because they leaned into the comedy of it. So
Yeah.
like they just leaned into the ridiculousness of both franchises. And I guess you could argue the tone was more like a Freddy movie, but it's like you're taking two franchises, which in my mind, like, don't get me wrong, I love both series, but they're not like great horror movies.
No,
They're really just not. So you're
Jason
taking
X,
two.
however, is one of the funniest movies ever made.
Oh, it's absolutely hilarious. So, like, yeah, that movie makes absolutely no sense. But yeah, you're taking two like horror franchises that never really took themselves too seriously and combining them and having some fun with it. So like, I love it. I know that's probably not a great take. A lot of people probably hate them, but like they were fun to me.
You never know. All right, I think our audience has probably heard enough movie stuff. I can talk movies all day long though, so
Yeah.
I'm glad we got a chance to do this. Let's get back to your background a little bit. So you're from New Orleans, but you're not from New Orleans. So where are you actually from?
Yeah, so I'd say the places that I've lived the longest have been Atlanta and then now Charlotte. Like I've lived in Charlotte since 2012, so that's easily the longest. And before that, I lived in Atlanta for about 8 years. But prior to that, my dad was in the military for a while. We moved around quite a bit. So I lived on the West Coast. I lived in California for a little while, North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota. My formative childhood years up until about my sophomore year of high school were all in West Virginia and Kentucky. And then we moved down to Atlanta after that, and kind of the rest is history.
All right. And so what was it like growing up like that, moving around a lot?
I'd say it's interesting, I guess. So my wife and the kids, they all think I'm weird because they're like, for me personally, it became normal for me to just walk up to a group of people and just introduce myself and start like, trying to get in where I fit in essentially.
Right.
But for them, like, growing up in a stable place, like it's odd for somebody to essentially be like I'll tell them, yeah, it's easy. Just go up, introduce yourself, essentially say, hey, I want to be my friend. And like everybody thinks that behavior is odd, but like for me, having moved around so much, it's like, all right, well, it's either that or I'm going to be eating lunch alone every day.
Yep. You got more practice.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, and so my wife moved around a lot. Her dad was a preacher and kind of jumped from churches and stuff. And I've got friends who are in the military and have seen their families move around. We've got bases around here as well. There's a big military presence in the South, just in general. So
Hmm.
there's a lot of that. And so I'm always just curious. It seems like there's probably a little bit of a difference when you're in a military family moving around because so it's so normal and expected that it's happening to a lot of the other people that are around you that are your uh, parents, friends, and colleagues
Hmm.
that they're working with, and so you've got a little bit more of a support group there versus just kind of up and moving around from city to city. Uh,
Yeah, I'd say it was more of because by the time we had really started bouncing around, my dad he basically did his residency in the military. So by the time we had started moving around a lot, it was more of just moving to where trying to find a place, trying to find a home essentially. So it was a little bit different in that regard. But I'd say like the big thing that kind of stuck with me was you gain a lot of perspective by being introduced essentially to a completely different side of the US. So you look at all these places. I always like to say like the US is basically just a bunch of small countries essentially that are states. So
yeah,
going from California to North Dakota or South Dakota, completely different. And same thing from even from Kentucky to West Virginia, like very different. And it's like one thing that I guess the metaphor I always use for going to Atlanta from like West Virginia or Kentucky is sports related because I played basketball. So you're in West Virginia and you're playing a pickup game, or even if you're at camp, I used to go to Marshall's for basketball camp, and you go and you just do like a very routine, normal dunk that you've practiced a ton of times. Everybody in the gym is like lighting up, like, oh, that's so amazing. You're so talented. And then you go down to Atlanta and you do that same thing, and it's like you're just another guy. You're just like everybody else. Like,
a lot of people practicing that.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
Nice. Yeah, that's a big fish, small pond situation. Yeah, that makes sense. And so how long have you been in Charlotte now?
So I've been in Charlotte for 12 years. So I graduated from Atlanta. I moved out to Phoenix to work for Lockheed Martin. That was my first job. And that
Really?
was yeah, yeah. So that was such an interesting experience because when, at least back in the time, I don't know if they do this still, but when they interview you, if you're a college grad, they basically interviewed like all the college kids at the same time. And they tried to get extend offers to as many of them as possible. So there are people that I interviewed with like that same week who we joined the company at the same time. We worked for the same teams. And then you have this like what I think is very novel in the software engineering industry is you had a ton of like junior engineers spread across a bunch of teams who are all in the same age range. So we all end up hanging out together. We have like parties at each other's houses, and we're still like great friends to to this day. I think that's a very different experience from normally you'll go to a company, it'll have maybe like one or two
Yeah.
juniors, but for the most part, you don't have like this group of people who are all in that same range coming in together. And it's kind of crazy that there's only a handful that have moved away. A lot of my friends who are still there, like from that group, they still hang out every other week or something like
Nice. So with Lockheed is very near and dear to my heart. I'm a huge fan of the SR-71 Blackbird and basically all of the various jet technologies that are out there. One of my favorite books of all time is Skunk Works, um, and so which really details all the history and innovation that went on around like creation of stealth technology and the
that.
SR-71 Blackbird and the U-2 and all that. And it's a really fascinating company, and so
Yeah.
it's one of those entities that I would have loved to go and work for at some point, but never really got the chance. So I'm always jealous whenever I hear somebody got to go work there. So that's cool.
Yeah, I like to say that my experience of like I worked at Lockheed just long enough to still have a very fond memory of it versus some of my peers who worked there for 5, 6, 7+ years. And their experience was kind of tarnished by like the later stages or how they ended up. For me, it's all kind of that honeymoon phase, I guess you could
Yeah,
say.
where you're still collecting the merchandise from the company and all that.
Exactly.
Like my first job was at a telecom company here in Greenville called Nuvox Communications,
Hmm.
and since been bought by Windstream. But literally on my desk right now, I've got my Nuvox pen right here
Nice. Yeah.
because I went to the company store and was like, I'm buying some Nuvox gear. I've got a bag, I've got a T-shirt, I had a mouse pad. The pen has lasted longer than just about anything else. The crazy thing about this pen is I've actually been using this pen for like 20 years without refilling the ink, and I don't know how it still works.
Yeah, that's wild.
It's a strange thing, but yeah, I get the honeymoon phase. There's always that appreciation, especially for first job,
Yep.
where you're just in wonder that you're here and you're looking at this huge entity, and something as big as Lockheed's got to be crazy too.
Yeah, no, I mean the it's so funny to have worked for a company where you have the highest level of security clearance, right?
Yeah.
Because I think I was TSSCI, top secret security clearance,
Wow.
to the point where like even when I was still in college, still graduating, they were like interviewing everybody that I had lived with for the past 7 years. But
Wow.
it's so interesting to have worked in like that uber secure environment and then go to other companies and hear them talk about like security and it's like oh you don't know the struggle of working in an environment where if you bring your phone into the environment you get written up like or you have to do a polygraph every 4 or 5 years to do your to like the level of stress in that environment compared to where we are we care about some AES encryption and some HTTPS but it's nothing like
Yeah.
uber serious.
It's very different from would you like to use your own laptop for work or
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
goodness. Yeah, I've taken a couple companies through the security certification process, like the SOC 2, ISO, high trust
Hmm.
type situations, and it's always interesting going through and documenting all the procedures and everything that are involved in trying to get it to something more clear. Because I'm a big security advocate in general about having these practices, but there's such a balance of is the benefit of this level of security actually worth it? The essentially the user experience of the security practices.
Hmm.
Does it become worth it? That's actually. Have you ever used a YubiKey?
Yes.
Okay, so that's something I'm a huge fan of because the user experience is perfect. It's the most secure thing you can do, and it's faster than every other form of two-factor authentication. Because I'm like, I've got one on my computer right here. If I need to log in, I just literally tap the button and I'm authenticated. And it's versus pulling out your phone, waiting for the timer to go down and punching in the 6-digit code, or waiting for the text message to come in and all that. Love it.
Yeah, no, I think that conversation about is the actual benefit worth it? Like that's something we struggle with, not just from a security perspective. I think all phases of engineering is like I find myself constantly having to ask people like, what is the business requirement for this thing? Are we just are we using Kubernetes because it's cool and sexy and everybody else is using it, or do we actually have a requirement where we need this level of orchestration,
Yeah,
and we need this level of sort of complexity in our infrastructure?
absolutely. So, we talked a lot about infrastructure, and so I'm gonna give you a chance to talk about, providers. I know you've done a lot of work with the infrastructure as code, infrastructure from code, and you've done a lot of different types of deployments. But is there anybody really getting your attention out there?
Yeah, so there's really two providers that I kind of say like they're kind of leading innovation. I'd say three actually. So there's three that are leading innovation in different ways. And then there's kind of everybody else would either be the big three, Azure, GCP, AWS, or the built on top of the big three, which would be like your Netlifys and your Vercels of the world. So to me, it's Fermion, Fly, and Cloudflare are all doing like very novel things. Like Fermion, they're taking the approach of what if we reimagined a cloud provider that's all built on top of WebAssembly, WASM. So the interesting thing there is that it democratizes, like going back to the idea of Nitric and how Nitric is basically building this SDK, this cross-language SDK that you can consume from Dart, TypeScript, and all that. If everything is built on top of WASM, then your ORM no longer becomes, well, I'm using JavaScript, so I got to use Prisma, or I'm using .NET, so I have to use like the .NET ORM. It now becomes, well, we just import this WASM module for our ORM, and then this module can work across every language that supports WASM. So to me, it really democratizes like cloud development in a way that you don't really have. And like the example I like to use, which I actually used in a blog that I wrote, like this release this week, is what if you could go from company A to company B, and irregardless of whether or not you were doing Python or .NET or JavaScript, the SDK was exactly the same. So essentially, like the language, sure, you got to learn the ins and outs of the language, but what you're actually doing, you can be productive from day one because the API is exactly the same going across all these environments. And I think that's what WebAssembly, I think that's what Nitric, and I think that's what WebAssembly both allow for in different ways.
That is an interesting approach to it for sure. I haven't done a lot with WebAssembly in general, and I've always heard it talked about on the front end,
Hmm.
as as a way to give people the option to utilize their favorite language on the front end instead of using JavaScript for everything.
Hmm.
There's always I'm, I've always been a big fan of the Beam VM with Elixir and Erlang,
Hmm. Hmm.
and it has a very novel way of doing things and parallelizing work. And it would be really interesting to be able to utilize something like that in the browser itself with something like WASM. But
Hmm.
I haven't really heard about it on the back end as much. So what's your experience been with that?
Yeah, so I've only barely scratched the surface. I've only played with Fermion a little bit, enough to deploy like a Hello World application. Um, but the like to the point, going back to like the similarities between Nitric and Fermion, essentially, Fermion is doing the exact same thing that Nitric is doing, but they have their own cloud provider. So they're building an SDK that allows you to build APIs and job servers and stuff like that. And it's all just using these using this WebAssembly framework that they're building out. And then I think that like the interesting benefit of WebAssembly in a serverless environment is your cold starts become, a matter of a couple milliseconds versus, hundreds of milliseconds because of the fact that you're compiling everything down to this assembly binary and just running that, when somebody's hitting your API that hasn't been hit in, a couple of days, spinning up that binary is going to take, relatively no time compared to spinning up like a Docker container or spinning up something that's much more heavyweight.
Yeah, and that makes really good sense too. I mean, from the start time for those serverless like Lambda type environments was always the big thing in question. I remember I remember the very first time that I heard about serverless environments in Lambda, my first reaction was, okay, so regular PHP is what we're doing now. Because that it was basically the CGI bin PHP Perl. Like just, start it up on the request, tear it down when the request is over kind of thing. And obviously there's a lot more optimizations going into it than that. But I remember that was my very first instinctive reaction when I heard about it.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's very much. I mean, software is all cyclical, right? Like if we're talking about Flutter, and the idea of cross-platform development, that existed as far back as like Smalltalk MVC, or back in the days when people were building desktop applications with C++
Right.
or C. Like so, we're all just cycling back to the same concepts. And now we have better technologies that help us realize these old ideas better. I mean, if you go back to the idea of all the theory around AI, all that stuff was developed in the 70s, but they didn't have the
Yeah.
processing power to actually realize
Yeah. Actually, funny you mentioned that. I interviewed somebody, Barry Johnson, on this podcast that was published a couple months back, and he was actually talking about that because he minored in AI at
it.
Clemson in the late '80s. And it was interesting hearing him talk about all the various concepts and everything, because it sounded like all of the exact same stuff that you hear today. I mean, they were doing this in the late '80s, and they had all the
Hmm.
all the theory and everything figured out. They just didn't have the equipment to do it.
Exactly. Yep. No. Yeah.
But yeah, that's really interesting stuff. So you also mentioned Cloudflare and Fly. So what do you see that Cloudflare is doing?
Yeah, so Cloudflare, they're very interesting because they're building their own technology stack as well in a different way. So they're building like a scalable version of Postgres. I think it's called D1.
Okay.
They also have this idea of you're going back to the idea of Nitric and how Nitric kind of inspects your code to figure out what you're deploying. They're doing that for you so that you don't even need a Nitric. So essentially, if you're building out an API, they understand that you're building out the API in a certain way, and they're able to build out your lambdas. I don't think they're called lambdas, but essentially the same sort of primitive. They're able to build
Cloudflare
out those
workers,
primitives
I
for you.
think is what it is.
Yeah, yeah, Cloudflare workers. And the downside is that currently, I think they only support JavaScript, but I think that's going to change eventually once they get like Docker support and all that. Then they'll have like very similar serverless capabilities to like a Fly.io. We haven't really talked about Fly, but Fly is very novel to me because they're essentially deploying everything on their own infrastructure. So they're deploying all of building out their servers in all of these different regions. And then when you go to deploy your API, they are essentially, you specify the region, they deploy to that region. So your API is always running at the edge. But then I also think Fly's integration model is very novel because you take something like a scalable serverless database. They were like, hey, we could build that ourselves, but we've already seen how successful a company like Supabase is. So we're just going to partner with them. So they're then just building the integration with Supabase to say, hey, when you deploy your serverless Fly instance, you essentially just deploy Supabase as well. You through our API, and we scale that out for you.
Yeah, Fly is a really interesting company. I remember seeing when they first started announcing, like, if you wanted to go and deploy something to Heroku, you get one dyno and you pay for your one dyno and you get your database and everything, and then it would set up behind a load balancer and had all these rules and everything. And Fly gives you a lot of the same stuff, but you start out, like, Fly wants you to start out with 3 instances of it, and they want
Hmm.
each one globally separated, and then you're going to have your database somewhere else, like in the middle.
Hmm.
And and I was looking at that, and my first thought was, okay, well, so how do I go about routing to this stuff? And then it turns out you're giving you one IP address for all of them, and it's an
Hmm.
Anycast IP address. And I'd never heard of Anycast being used outside of a DNS.
Hmm.
And so it was the first provider I'd ever seen that was actually doing servers with an Anycast IP address. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Anycast, it basically lets you geolocate servers with the same IP address all over the globe. And when you need a fast response time, you'll end up just getting whichever one is geographically closest to you.
Hmm.
And so DNS servers do this all the time to give you fast DNS responses to do your domain lookups. but I hadn't heard of it for actual servers before. And
Yeah.
it was really fascinating. They've been doing a lot of things to push the edge. They hired Chris McCord, who from the Elixir team, who built Phoenix. They've been doing
Hmm.
all the Phoenix Live View stuff, which was a natural pairing because if you get Live View closer to the people who are doing it, and everything is kind of server side powered, it was kind of cool. But very very interesting company. Agreed.
Yeah, no, very fast. I mean, all three of these providers, which kind of why I said I'm excited about them, and I think they're all interesting, is they're pushing the boundaries of what technology can do, and they're really trying to realize, like, okay, these are the things that we have available to us right now.
No,
So if we were building AWS today, this is how we believe these services. This is how we would believe AWS or GCP would look today, and they have different ideas, but they're all kind of approaching the same things when you talk about like the ease of use from a developer's perspective, from orchestration and management and maintainability, from scaling and deploying things out to the end user, essentially deploying things out to the edge. Like they're all converging around the same set of like features that to me, like this next generation of applications that we build is going to be a lot easier than the previous generation. Like people always ask me, like, as a Flutter developer, are you scared that Google's going to get rid of Flutter, or are you scared that Flutter is not going to be popular 5, 10 years from now? And my response is always like, well, if Flutter loses and we're not using Flutter 10 years from now, that means that what we are using is so much better than what Flutter was and will improve our lives so much better. And I think it's true of these cloud providers. I think that if you're starting a company today and you just throw a dart and say we're using this provider, it's going to be a significant improvement over what we were doing 10 years ago.
that's probably accurate. That's probably pretty accurate. It is always interesting to see the DHH approach of trying to get off of the cloud providers and go back into a data center that he's been pushing. I know they advertise all the Basecamp stuff moving on, and that was kind of headline news with their Kamal deployment platform. So you could use it to deploy to Kubernetes or something, or you could use it to deploy locally, which is pretty cool. But you never know
Yeah.
with those. So so back to Flutter. Anything interesting that you've been working on with Flutter that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, so for the past almost 2 years, the main application that I've been working on is in the NIL space. For those of you not familiar with what NIL means, it stands for name, image, and likeness. And basically, it's a set of laws that passed, I think, within the last 5 years that allow college athletes to profit off of their name, image, and likeness. So college athletes, since the dawn of time, essentially haven't been making money. And I think over the last 5 years, they are capable of now like making money and profiting off
We'll,
of things like merchandising
we'll
and
go with quote unquote haven't been making money.
yeah, yeah, quote unquote. Yeah, exactly. Legally have not been allowed to, make money.
Yeah.
So what the application is called Fan Inc. The company that has been making the application is called Viva Equity. And what Fan Inc. allows you to do is it essentially connects the college athlete directly to the fan. So from the fans' perspective, they can follow college athletes, they can contribute money to the college athlete, and they'll get back an NFT trading card for their contributions. And we also have like tiered NFT trading cards where if you donate a certain amount of money, you get back a certain type of trading card. And from the athlete's perspective, basically the application offers a full financial suite. So it gives them a debit card and a checking account. It allows them to track their transactions. It allows them to do their quarterly tax contributions. Since NIL players currently are essentially contractors, they have to manage. If you're a contractor, you have to manage your tax contributions yourself. And I don't know if you've ever done that yourself, you can imagine the experience is probably pretty jarring for an 18-year-old who just got to college and has never had to manage or pay bills at all in their life. So
Yeah.
it's a full financial platform on top of being a way for them to like share and broadcast their profile to the world.
Nice. That definitely seems like it'll add some value. I know there's a lot of push for some uniformity in legislation because it's so kind of all over the place on a state to state basis. Is that a challenge, dealing with the various different state regulations?
No, not real, or at least not from Uptech side. Fortunately, the guys on Viva's side have been very like active in building those relationships, not just with schools, but understanding what the rules and regulations are. And I think the next interesting development is the idea of schools having these collectives, which a collective basically means like a pool, like essentially if you donate a pool of money to the school and that money is distributed out to all the athletes. So there's a lot of capability there where we now want to add that ability directly into FanInc, where you can manage your collective in FanInc rather than having to manage it separately.
Yeah, that makes sense. As a college football fan, my entire life, it's been both interesting and painful to watch this whole NIL experience come out, because on the one hand, you support the idea that the guys should be able to make money on their name, because they were all amateur athletes before, and
Hmm.
there was like a limit to how much money they could get from a summer job. And you had stuff like coaches getting investigated if they hired a player to mow their lawn and stuff like
Hmm.
that. And you had all this nitpicking that was going on. If you gave somebody an extra dessert on a visit, now you're getting a secondary violation. It was all ridiculous, and it was, to a degree, you understood, because the whole point of even the 85 scholarship limit that was there was to preserve fairness in the game, to make it so that each
Hmm.
school could kind of equally compete.
Hmm.
And but then the TV money started pouring in,
Hmm.
and I still blame TiVo for this, because the moment that TiVo made it where you could record something and fast forward through the commercials back in the I guess right around 2000,
Hmm.
and that became popular, and then DVR started coming out to do the same thing. You would, anything that you didn't care about watching live, you would just fast forward through the commercials, and
Hmm.
the stuff that everybody cared about watching live was sports,
Hmm.
as you had to watch it as it was on, which made the advertising time for sports on TV the most valuable thing that there was. And advertisers started figuring this out pretty quickly, and then you started realizing on the college eyeballs, you had all these alumni fans with college degrees, so you had valuable spender eyeballs that you were
Hmm.
trying to market to, and the money just kept pouring in and pouring in. The Netflix only made it worse, and it really just really focused all of this advertising money in this one area, and all of a sudden your budgets went through the roof, because
Hmm.
like when I was in school, Clemson's entire athletic department budget was $30 million. And I remember that we went to the Humanitarian Bowl in Idaho, in Boise, Idaho, one year,
Hmm.
and they got up and they talked at the conference to the people in Boise who were really trying to grow the team at Boise State, and whoever, I think we were played Louisiana Tech in that game. And they got up and were talking about the different budgets, and they went up and said, oh, we have a $30 million athletic budget, and everybody was like, wow, just blown away. And now it's like 130 million,
Hmm.
and it's completely just off the rails different in terms of the amount of money that poured in and changed things. And it's interesting when you have conversations about the NIL stuff with everybody, they're like, oh, well, this has been a problem for years where all this money was
Hmm.
pouring in. No, all this money was not pouring in all these years. It is a very recent thing in the last 20 years that has completely
Uh-huh.
sent this thing sideways. Because like in the 80s, there was a guy that played for Clemson and then went on to play for the Redskins, and he joked that whenever he went to the NFL, he took a pay cut. Joked. We'll go with it.
Yeah, yeah.
But, but yeah.
Yeah, no, it's like to your point, it's so interesting, like the history, because it's like you said, when the advertising money started rolling, I think the same thing is true for sports at the pro level. Like in the 80s and the 70s, you still had players who were still, what is it? I think it was Magic who signed like a lifetime contract for like $5 million or something like that. So you still had players who weren't making a ton of money, you know, you compare the amount of money that they were making to like sort of the lifelong pursuit of their craft, and they weren't
Right.
making that much money.
Yeah.
But once you got those advertising dollars involved, then obviously everything just ballooned. And like I think that NIL, I think where it'll eventually end up is great for college athletes. I think right now it's kind of in this muddy water, trying to figure it out, trying to figure out what the best policies and practices
Right.
are. Um, but having played college sports, because I played basketball and I ran track, I was never like amazing in basketball, but I was always good enough to like be on the team and always one of the most athletic players. In track, like I just started late, I probably could have been way better in track. But being on that side of trying to be a college athlete, quote unquote, I'd say even on the best of days, you're still more athlete than you are college student. I mean, we're talking basketball, you're practicing for at least 3 hours a day. That's going to cut into your
Study time.
engineering time, yeah, your studying time, your lab time, all that stuff. So I've definitely seen the effects. Like from my perspective, I prioritize my school over athletics. So, it became a situation where like, the coach isn't going to play me if I'm missing practice, like missing a ton of practice, as much. So like I can see like you always have to sacrifice on one end of the fence. Like
Yeah.
if you're either sacrificing your athletics or you're sacrificing your education.
And there's always been, I know one of the early things that Clemson did that was kind of dramatic in the late '80s, early '90s when we had Danny Ford there, and Danny Ford was the first coach to win a national championship for Clemson, the only other coach to win a national championship for Clemson football, and he was campaigning for years to get a football dorm.
Hmm.
He just wanted a football dorm that he could make really, really nice for recruiting purposes and everything. And the school wanted an academic support center
Hmm.
for athletes so that they could do a better job of getting the degrees.
Hmm.
And I don't want to misrepresent what Ford's take was, but I've essentially heard that he didn't really care that much about that. He was all about
Hmm.
getting the dorm because that's what the athletes cared about. But time kind of proved things out where the school was really committed to this. And when
Hmm.
they hired Tommy Bowden, it was a big thing. They were really concerned about bringing in any athletes that weren't going to be able to cut it academically. And we lost out on like some 5-star receivers who went to North
Hmm.
Carolina but couldn't get into Clemson for some reason. And and it was always just a really interesting thing to follow. But the Academic Support Center won, and they really had a big commitment to that. And now, you've got Dabo, and he's really pushing the exact same thing on
Hmm.
you're here to get an education
Hmm.
and play football in that
Hmm.
order. And I think Clemson right now has, I believe, the highest student athlete GPA across the board, like even including the Ivy League schools.
Yeah.
And so, I think there's like a GPR rate that they use to track the students. And so, seeing Clemson specifically as a Clemson fan invest so heavily in trying to make this experience of really preparing people for careers outside of sports,
Hmm.
uh, while all of this NIL stuff is coming in, and then you've got guys like Nick Saban who are quitting essentially because after the game he said all his players cared about was how much they were going to get paid or they were going to transfer.
Hmm.
It's tough to watch because in the NFL they still have contracts.
Yep.
Like you say, you're going to get this much and you're going to be here. With the transfer thing in place, where they can just up and transfer anywhere, anytime, it's currently just mass chaos.
Hmm.
And I
Yes.
really do hope they can get this thing narrowed down at some point. And
Yeah, it feels like, maybe in a couple of years we'll be in a much better place than we are now. Like going back to like
yeah,
Fanik and the idea that we want to be able to manage collectives, it kind of feels like collectives are kind of the thing that all the schools are kind of buying into, this idea of just pulling funds and then
yeah,
distributing those funds kind of evenly out. It definitely feels like that's the way to go forward. But yeah, to your point, like it's very interesting to see players, they'll just put their name, in the transfer portal, say they need to declare, because you want to capitalize on your time, right? Like
yeah,
there's less than 1%, less than 0.01% chance of you going professional in most sports. So for a lot of these kids, this is going to be the most money that they're going to see in this thing that they've essentially been trying to do their entire life. They've
yeah,
been trying to realize this dream their entire life. So I can see both sides of the coin. Like from the fan, it's obviously frustrating, but then from the athlete side, they finally have the ability to profit on something that, before they might never be able to profit on. Like,
Yeah.
but there's such a large pool of college athletes that there is an opportunity for them to seize. And then I think that like I like the idea you brought up about um, Clemson's desire to provide an education, because the thing I think you couple that with like the NIL, and now the benefit becomes you don't have to put your name in the hat to try and go to pro,
Yeah.
after 1 or 2 years. Like you can stay in college a little bit longer and you can make money here. And you'll also finally, you'll realize the benefit of being at an institution for 4 to 6 years and getting an actual education versus before, there was a lot of pressure for you after 1 to 2 years, depending on the sport, to go and sort of provide for your family.
Yeah, absolutely. And that makes perfect sense too. I know we're running long. This is also something that clearly we're both pretty interested in. The one of the things that always gets me is that, I played offensive line in high school. I played offensive and defensive line. We were a small school. I'm not a big guy. And so we did not win a lot of games with me playing offensive and defensive line. We were a 4A school that had 35 players and we finished 2-9, but we beat our rival and that's all any of us really cared about. Take that, South Florence. But, but it always just struck me with the NIL rules that the marketability of specific players may outpace their actual value to the team, separate from their performance on the field. And like for offensive linemen in particular, if you've got a Trevor Lawrence at quarterback, he has to not be on his back in order to do the things that he needs to do to be marketable himself. And so, if you've got a top level offensive line but the quarterback is the guy that everybody wants to see on TV and send the money to, at what point is there going to be a thing where their offensive line says, hey, we insist on a piece of your NIL pie, or this blocker's getting through? Like that's what always concerned me of is it going to get so unbalanced towards the few star personalities? Or football is a team sport. I mean, everybody has to be doing their job on every single play, or it's not going to work. But defense, you got to be working together and be in the right position. One guy's out of position, you left a hole. It doesn't matter if you've got a linebacker that's getting 10 sacks a game, if the secondary is not covering things properly and people are getting through. And it's, I don't know, the team sport aspect of it bothers me a little bit from the current NIL setup, the lack of essentially a salary cap, or some way of effectively managing it so that it can be somewhat consistent across the team and whatnot. And so I do like that to a degree. Some fans and schools seem to be handling it like Dabo. I know, for example, he said like across the board, if you're on the team at Clemson, everybody's getting at least this much. And so they've at least set like a high minimum for everybody, which I think that came out in an article a month or so ago. Like if you're playing at Clemson, you're getting, I think, like $140,000 worth of benefits, period.
Yeah, that's outstanding. Yeah. And I think that analogy is perfect because, I mean, I was a pretty decent fan of Colorado this year, and like the difference between Shadur Sanders and Caleb Williams was the offensive line. like Shadur, the highest paid NIL player in the league, and just get beat up every game because his offensive line just couldn't stay in front of anybody. So that's a perfect analogy. Like there has to be some level of balance. On the one end, like you hope that the integrity of the game is protected to the point where these players aren't just like, I'm not making a lot of money so I'm not going to do good at my job. But on the other hand, like I think there is a certain level of responsibility to make sure that there's some level of equity across the board for these teams.
I agree. And you also have to take into account that just being on the team comes with a lot of value. Like even if you had a scholarship period, what the amount of money that people are coming out of school and with student debt every year, having free college, essentially being marketed by the school for the whole entire 4 years, maybe 5 years that you're there. I mean, not a lot of people get that, not to mention a staff of full-time people who are there to do nothing but to make sure you succeed and can really self-actualize and coach you on how to do all that stuff, from people managing your food that you're eating to your training and everything else and coaching you along the way. There's a lot of value there, regardless whether or not. And then on top of all of it, you got walk-ons who are doing this, and they're just saying, you know what, I just want to be a part of this, and I don't care if I'll get a scholarship. I will pay my own way. I see the value in it here, and it's an interesting dichotomy. But we're running really, really long, and so I need to close out. Anything you want to leave us with?
No, nothing at all. It's a pleasure. It's the first time I've ever done a podcast before, so hopefully for everybody it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was great to have you on. I really enjoyed it. I was always happy to get to talk college sports and movies all in one podcast, along with the technology. So this is going to go in my personal highlight reel of fun interviews. So thanks a lot for coming.
Sports, movies, and tech all rolled into one.
Exactly. It's like the perfect podcast.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks a lot. Really enjoyed having you. I've got to give my weekly shout out to Herd Media. Thanks to Herd for helping me get this podcast off the ground. If you're looking for advice in starting a podcast or guidance and help with actually professionally publishing, if you've got a budget to do it, they are the people to contact. Go to trustherd.com. And with that, this has been the sports version of the Carolina Codecast.